If you've been on Twitter in the past couple weeks, you may have had the pleasure of seeing the smug, self-righteous discourse leading up to the release of the new Joker movie. If you're not on Twitter, maybe you saw some similar, albeit more long-winded, op-eds in the media. The new Joker movie is incel bait. It's a call to action for violent white males. Worst of all, it's empathetic toward a group that deserves no empathy. The ubiquitous violent white male, constantly on the verge of carrying out the next mass shooting, angry at a world in which he has the highest form of privilege but can never be satisfied. So privileged, in fact, that in his failure to grasp the life which is owed to him, he resorts to the kind of violence only his kind can carry out. If this characterization is true, the moral panic surrounding a film like Joker must be justified. A film that portrays this kind of person positively might be just the catalyst the next mass shooter needs to finally pick up the gun. Well, that's the argument anyway, but does it bear any truth? And more importantly, even if art has the power to incite violence, do we have a moral obligation to reject it? Some voices have begun to argue that Joker is an irresponsible movie that glorifies white male terroristic violence. Let's take that as true for the sake of argument. If a movie like this is dangerous, then everything the moral majority of the 80s and 90s said about violence, sex, homosexuality, hell, Dungeons and Dragons, Doom, Grand Theft Auto must also be valid. And in the era of the moral majority, we did allow our media to be sanitized, but we weren't better for it. Pretending the darker parts of our lives don't exist didn't make them go away. The fact is, we do live in a deeply violent culture, and if our media is honest, it reflects that. We must also reckon with another question. Is the artist obligated to sanitize their art for the sake of safety? Is an artist obligated to sanitize their work for their own safety? If they are, critics would have to serve as our moral arbiters. But liberals seem to be totally willing to let the creative elite function as such, and welcome creative suppression in the name of safety. On April 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold massacred 12 of their fellow students and one teacher, ushering the United States into the era of mass shootings. And they haven't stopped since. And with that came the knee-jerk responses, scapegoating and a desperate attempt to find a cause or perhaps deflect. Or maybe that response was simply a means of eliminating whatever media the accuser had already found offensive. In the case of Columbine, right-wing critics immediately deflected blame onto Marilyn Manson and first-person shooters like Doom, media they already despised as being bad influences that were leading kids astray.
Listen to the same dark, apocalyptic music, and together nurse their same dark hatreds and frustrations.
Doom calls on players to use pipe bombs, frag bombs, and shotguns to kill all the other players. In his online profile, Harris used phrases that are used by people who play the computer game Doom.
And then there are the video games that play out the most violent fantasies. And so do popular movies aimed at young audiences. And some people have noted similarities between the 1995 film Basketball Diaries and the killings in Littleton. It is a different teenage culture. What didn't exist in the 50s was pornography at the click of a mouse, lurid websites with a dank reek of Satanism.
It was convenient that all their warnings had miraculously come true. Left-wing commentators often criticized these motives as deflecting from what they saw as the real problem: guns, mental illness, and bullying in schools. In 2019, the tables have turned. The mantle of moral superiority has fallen to the left. In Joker, Arthur Fleck, the titular character, states, "All I have are negative thoughts." The film portrays a mentally ill man increasingly alienated by the social and institutional powers around him. As his actions spiral more out of control, his grip on reality becomes seemingly more stable. He confronts his delusions and acts on them. The viewer is treated to an empathetic read of a man who becomes a monster. This, oddly, is the crux of critics' antipathy towards the film. It is precisely because the film is empathetic in its treatment of Arthur that makes it so dangerous. If the film were to simply cast Joker as a psychopath intent on bringing destruction and chaos into the world, think Heath Ledger's performance in The Dark Knight or Christian Bale as Patrick Bateman, would there be the same sort of moral outrage? It betrays some doublethink on the part of critics. Well, This film gives plausible reasoning for this character's descent into violence, and I don't like that. For whatever reason, a violent character must be a priori violent and monstrous for no reason at all. This is a comforting position to take. If these people are violent by nature, then there is no reason to inspect the reason for their violence. There are none. The catalyst for their action is simply the opportunity to act. This line of thinking is conveniently scarce in actionable dialogue. It ignores the broader issue, the conditions we live in that lead to this kind of violence. Arthur does not commit violence because he feels he is above the people he's committing violence against. This is made clear. Privileged discourse fails here, and fails in the broader cultural critique of this film taking place when mass shootings exist. We are not captains of our own ship, as neoliberals would like to tell you. The world we live in affects us in ways we cannot control, and humans often react in extremely negative ways. How do you think a life of abject poverty, or violence, or abuse would twist and contort a person? We can condemn a person for his violent acts, but we can also recognize that these acts were preventable. A stronger welfare state, more protection for children, better access to medical and psychiatric treatment, a more empathetic society. These moral critiques of Joker fail on another level. They are not moral at all. They are, in fact, the opposite. Empathy doesn't imply support, it implies understanding the chain of events that lead to tragic actions. Here's the thing. We're living in an age where outrage politics, once the domain of the right, are now bipartisan. Both sides are scrambling to find reasons for what appears to be an increasingly violent world. So sure, decry a film because you're scared of some hypothetical consequences. But then what about all the films that came before? Should we ban Taxi Driver, Natural Born Killers, Elephant, and the countless other movies that depict this kind of violence? Glorify, even? Going back to Columbine, Mark Ames has this to say. One reason why our society has failed to curb bullying is that we like bullies. Hell, we are bullies. Research has shown that bullies are not the antisocial misfits that adults, in their forced amnesia, want them to be. At Columbine, parents and students both felt that bullies were favored by teachers and administrators, and that complainers were often ignored or blamed. Indeed, losers pay for being losers twice over in our schools, taking both the punishment and the blame. Joker tells the story of a man perpetually bullied, who eventually turns his alienation outward in the form of violence. We can compartmentalize Arthur because his identity as a white male must mean there are no systemic reasons for his violence. And that's the heart of the issue here. When we reduce people to this identity, we often ignore the power that class and experience can have on a person's ability to function in society. Policing the morality of art is a privilege, and maybe the people so upset with this film were offended by its treatment of the elite. They see a character like Arthur Fleck and think, know your place.